I'm Alton Yates, Lieutenant Colonel retired. I hail from Jacksonville, Florida. I'm a fourth generation native of the city of Jacksonville, and I did 32 years with the United States Air Force, combination of active duty, reserve, and guard time. And I'm happily retired with a wife, two children, and three grandchildren. In junior high school, middle school, my coach, my football coach, was named Charles Chappie James, and he was a big man, about 6'4", 6'5". He had a brother who served in the Air Force at that time. His brother was a Tuskegee Airman, and he would talk to us about him all the time. And he invited his brother to come to the school to speak to a gathering of the classes there in chapel. And this guy walks out on the stage. He is a big, probably 6'6", 6'7", Air Force major, I believe, at that time. He was either a captain or a major. And he introduced himself in a big, booming baritone voice by saying, "I am an American warrior." And he captivated that audience. When Major James spoke, you could hear a pin drop in that auditorium anywhere. He actually captivated that audience, and I sat there and hung on every word he said. He talked about the new opportunities that were being made available to people of color in the United States Air Force, and at that time, it had just really become an independent branch of service. It had, prior to that, been the Army Air Corps, and this was probably in 1951, 52. And so it was the new branch of the military, and Major James at that time told us that there were going to be all kinds of opportunities for people of color. And in order to be able to take advantage of those opportunities, it was going to be necessary for us to pay exceptionally close attention to what our teachers were trying to impart to us. So he made completion of a high school education and entry into college, if at all possible. He emphasized those things, made it very important to us. From that day forward, I could only dream of the United States Air Force. I don't know whether the general public is really aware of the tremendous contribution made to the total integration of American society by the Tuskegee Airmen. I mean, that was an opportunity for a group of men of color to demonstrate that people of color could succeed at just about any kind of occupation. If they could fly airplanes, they could do just about anything else. But those guys wanted to be able to show this country that they were just as capable as anyone else, and they did so in a marvelous way. After entering tech school, what I would be doing, I was going to be a supply sergeant. And I figured after tech school, I would be assigned to a base and I would become the supply technician for that base. My goodness, how different things turned out for me. I was immediately assigned to the Aeromedical Field Laboratory at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. And the Aeromedical Field Laboratory was one of the forerunners in conducting experiments to determine the effects of space travel on the human body. I had no idea what any of that meant. But I met Colonel John Paul Stapp, who was the director of the laboratory out there. He was a lieutenant colonel, medical doctor, looked more like a Baptist minister to me. Just one of the finest people I'd ever had the pleasure of meeting. And he gave me an introduction to what they were doing at that laboratory. I sat there, and it was difficult for my mind to, put into focus the kinds of things that he was talking about. I mean, I'd never heard of a rocket sled. I'd never heard anything at all about underwater experiments being conducted using men to conduct those experiments. And I heard all of this, trying to process all of this as a young enlisted man was just overwhelming. He invited me to become one of his subjects, and I immediately volunteered. And that was the beginning of a new life for me, a new way of life for me. Remember, I said that Jacksonville was one of the most racially segregated cities in the South. We never had very much contact with people other than those who were just like me, And when I got to Holloman and the Air Force experience, I entered into a new world, a world that you couldn't even dream, where there was never, ever any hint of segregation, of prejudice, of discrimination. And it became a new way of life for me. Those of us who became engaged in the experiments were like family. We depended on each other, and I think that's the way we survived. We survived by being able to depend 100% on each other. And Colonel Stapp, he was the ideal person to lead a program such as that. I understand he had his first rocket sled ride back in the 40s, 1947 or 48, I believe. The unique thing about him was that he would allow himself to be the subject on each of the experiments before anyone else. He led the way, and he led by example. And the amazing thing was that his example was one that everyone was eager to follow. That small group of volunteers that we had would have followed that man to hell and back, I believe. But he was fearless, he was cautious, he was careful, he was understanding, and he was like a father figure to us. I'll never forget the day I walked in and he looked at me and said, you're a fine specimen of a man, and I'm going to see just how much you can take. But he said that to every one of the volunteers who came into that laboratory, every one of them. He led us by example. And I'll always be grateful for where his example led me, because it changed my whole life. It gave me a new outlook on life, one that I had not been exposed to. And I learned to live with people who taught me how to depend on not only the ingenuity of others, but how to make contributions and depend on my own livelihood. Colonel Stapp was a jokester. I mean, he teased a lot. And I remember when I was being introduced to my first ride, he said to me, he says, I'm going to put you in a slingshot and I'm going to shoot you from here to there. And I had no idea what he was talking about. But I had seen the bopper sled. This was the smallest sled that we used. I remember when I sat down in that chair and they were putting the instruments on my body and strapping me in. I closed my eyes and the countdown began. And I think it was probably the longest countdown I have ever heard. It was my first. And I could hear the numbers coming off in my head, 9, 8, 7, 6. And it seemed like he is never going to get to the point where he says fire. But then it happened. And the sensation was something that is almost indescribable now. When that chair took off down that track, the sled, it felt like everything that was in my body was trying to come out through the front. And I remember when it hit the brake and finally came to a stop, I breathed a sigh of relief. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what I would feel. And when I survived it, I said, well, you know, I could do that. I could do that again. And I just became addicted to being involved in those kinds of tests. My first ride was a frontal ride. So, and I would think that probably 20 G's was as much as I pulled at that time. And I went on to ride the bopper sled more than 60 times and pulled as many as 60 G's on that sled. So it was quite an experience for me. The bopper was just one of the sleds we rode. We had the Daisy, which was a sled that could travel 100 miles an hour in 50 feet. It's hard to explain what that felt like when that sled hit the water brake. But the conditions that we were trying to simulate, we were trying to determine the effect of space travel on the human body. So we didn't know at that time what the effect of space travel would be, but Colonel Stapp figured that if we could simulate on the ground the kind of experience man would have flying into space, then we'd be able to develop the various safety mechanisms needed to take him safely there and bring him back. And we concentrated our efforts on trying to do that. On the bopper sled, it's where we really proved that seat belts could save lives. All of the Department of Defense vehicles were then fitted with seat belts. And we had used them, I want to think about a couple of years, and Colonel Stapp was still trying to convince the automotive industry to change and begin installing seat belts. We did a contract with Ford Motor Company, who was supporting some of the technology that we were developing out there. And finally, the American automobile industry was coaxed and prodded and almost forced into installing seat belts in the automobiles. At first, there was a lot of reluctance. People just, number one, they didn't want to undergo the extra cost it would cost to put them in. They didn't think the public would use them. And somehow we were finally able to get people to understand that seat belts save life. And as a result of the tests that we did at Holloman, we were finally able to get the American automobile industry to install seat belts in all of their vehicles. That, in my opinion, was one of the greatest contributions made by those guys out there at Holloman in the 1950s. It's just proved to be a remarkable and ingenious idea, but those were the kinds of ideas that Colonel Stapp had. You look at the machinery and all of the equipment that is used in the manufacture of these magnificent machines today and think about the crude instruments that we were working with during that time. I mean, it's like night and day. It was an eye-opener for me to see how far we have evolved as far as technological advances are concerned. The equipment we use was, well, you look at the gee-whiz sled over there, that's primitive compared to the modern equipment you see here now. And it's just amazing that man's mind could conceive and build and test and prove all of this various equipment. And I think the way it is displayed here, it shows the evolution of technology in this country. And I know and understand the importance of being prepared. I mean, prepared for any eventuality. And I just thank God that we had people who were willing to dedicate themselves. Looking at the gee-whiz took me back to perhaps the most famous sled ride of them all, and that was when Colonel Stapp rode the Sonic Wind #1. Sonic Wind and gee-whiz, if you looked at the two sleds, there's a tremendous difference, and it shows the kind of advancements that were made. But Sonic Wind was basically a chair mounted on a platform that was pushed down a track using rockets. And the subject, Colonel Stapp, was exposed to the elements. And he rode that sled at 632 miles an hour and came to a complete stop in 1 9/10 seconds. And if you can imagine the G-force on his body at that time, it's amazing that he was able to do that. But it also gave us what we needed to be able to develop safe escape mechanisms from not only supersonic aircraft, which hadn't been developed. See, the reason I talk about the minds of the scientists who were developing those kinds of tests was because somehow they foresaw a time when we would have supersonic aircraft, when we would be shooting men out to space in rockets. And of course, if we're going to engage in those kind of experiments, there had to be safety mechanisms. There had to be ways of protecting the men and women who would be used in those experiments. And what I've been trying to wrap my mind around is how on earth they were able to foresee a need for the kind of devices that they were experimenting with during that time. I would really like for people, anyone who hears the story, to understand is the incredible opportunities available to youngsters in this country through our Department of Defense. And hopefully our youngsters will concentrate on science and math and technologies so that we can continue the advancements that we've made. The opportunities are unlimited, but in order to take advantage of those opportunities, our young people must be educationally prepared. And it is incumbent upon all of us to do everything in our power to see to it that they are prepared to take advantage of the opportunities that will become available to them. That's what makes us #1 in the world, and it will keep us #1 if we are able to continue to produce the kinds of people who can dream big dreams and then turn those dreams into reality.